Hi, Professor Potowski. Thank you so much for agreeing to have this interview with us. All these questions have been prepared by our intern Patrick Gaston, but he can't be there, so I'll be asking you the questions. Can you please tell us what are you researching at this moment?
At this moment, I'm looking at what we call bilingual dual immersion schools. Some people call them two-way immersion, some people call them dual language schools. These are bilingual schools in which typically about half of the kids speak the non-English language at home. Okay. Some of those children also already know English when they show up to school. Others of them know no English when they show up to school. So they are what we call ELLs, English language learners. And the other half or large percentage of the students at these schools speak no Spanish in the home, but their parents have decided they want them to learn Spanish. So they show up to preschool or kindergarten, and they're dropped into this environment where it's mostly Spanish being spoken. And so both of these groups of children learn from and with each other. Some of these schools go through 5th grade, 6th grade. This one I'm studying goes through 8th grade. Okay? And so the idea is to look at their Spanish development, to look at their English development, and to look at their academic achievement. And I'll tell you what has been found in some other parts of the country. Work like this has been done in Los Angeles and also in Houston. Here's what they find. Number one, the children, the English language learning children, okay? When you look at their English, the children who learn English the best are the ones who studied in Spanish. Sounds completely counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense. How could that be? Shouldn't the kids who studied in English all day long do better on English standardized tests? They do not. It's the children who had that home language support, right? As they were learning English, they didn't fall behind in their subject areas, and we know more and more about transfer, right, between different languages. So it's clearly providing some kind of benefit for the English language learning of children who need to learn English. It's also resulting in higher levels of overall academic achievement for these children. And when you look at the Spanish, this doesn't really surprise anybody. The Spanish of the children in the dual immersion bilingual programs is stronger than the Spanish of Latino children who were in all English programs. So that's some of what we're finding. And then when you look at the non-home Spanish-speaking children, parents ask, is their English going to suffer? I don't want to put them in a program that uses so much Spanish if their English is going to be acquired more slowly or less completely, let's say. And what the research is finding is that that's not a worry at all. The kids do equally as well, if not better, than their peers who were in all English programs. Plus, these kids learn Spanish. Some of them learn it quite impressively well. And they're also doing just as well on their academic areas. So it's really a no-brainer. It's a win-win. And I'm looking at two groups of children in the same building, okay? Because this building has the dual bilingual language track and the all English track. So I'm comparing the children in the two tracks from the same building, looking at their Spanish, looking at their English, and looking at their academics.
And how long will it last?
I'm sorry?
How long will this last?
The study? Well, what I've done is what we call pseudo-longitudinal. It's not truly longitudinal. It'll take me, 8 years to follow a group of children. So what I've done is I've chosen first graders, third graders, fifth graders, and eighth graders. So the assumption is that, for example, the eighth graders are sort of future fifth graders who are future third graders, etc. So I went in just for one semester and gathered all this data, and so I'm sitting down and looking at it. So the data collection is over. Now, how long will it take for me to study it and write it up? That remains to be seen.
Very cool. So the second question is, were you exposed to two distinct dialects from birth?
No. I was raised in Comac, here in Long Island. And I would say I was exposed to a typical sort of New York City area English. One might say that my mother's English, she was raised in Freeport, looks a little bit different than my stepfather's English. He was raised in Queens. So his English variety, for example, uses the variable he don't, she don't, whereas my mother says he doesn't, she doesn't. So to the extent that you could call that a dialectal difference, then perhaps, and there are a few other differences as well. But for the most part, I would say no. I was raised with a New York City area, you might say, English. However, I moved to the Midwest when I was 17. So I think I would probably say right now that I'm bidialectal in English, in that the way I'm speaking right now has become my dominant English dialect. It's more of it has Midwestern features. But sometimes when I'm on the phone with my family or I come back here to this area, I start talking like this again because this is how I was raised. You know, I notice these subtle changes in my, not so subtle, changes in my.
It just comes back.
It comes back. Of course, I'm very, very aware of it. I was aware of it when it started to go away. I remember in graduate school saying the word carrot for the first time instead of carrot, and saying Florida instead of Florida, saying orange instead of orange. I remember one by one these vowel sounds drifting away from me. I was very aware of it. So I'm also aware when I go back. What's interesting, I think, is that even when I try my best to reconverge on my first dialect, my New York English, I don't hit it 100%. I miss things.
Very interesting. Okay, so here comes the third question. With the amount of Hispanic cultures to choose from, what made you focus on Mexican and Puerto Rican cultures? Is there a cultural or linguistic overlap that makes the pair particularly interesting?
It's actually their lack of overlap that makes them interesting. The reason I focus on Mexicans and Puerto Ricans is a very pragmatic one. That's who's in Chicago. About 70% of Chicago Latinos are of Mexican origin, and well, over the past 20 years, it's ranged from 10% to 15, 16% of the Chicago Latino population that was Puerto Rican. So that's who's there. So it just made sense to study them. But the question of whether there's overlap, they are two groups that I find to be very, very different. I think there's more differences both linguistically, pragmatically, and culturally between Mexicans and Puerto Ricans than there would be, for example, between Mexicans and Guatemalans. That's my sense. I don't know Guatemalan communities and peoples very well, but from what I have read and seen and sensed and talking with people, there are a lot more similarities, for example, between those two groups than there would be between a Caribbean group, be it Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, or Cubans, and a group like Mexicans or Peruvians, for example. So they're very different, which is what makes it so much fun. Even lay people who speak Spanish, when you hear someone speaking a variety that's a Mexican variety, we all know there's not one Mexican Spanish, but what's considered a typical Mexican variety, within about a second or two, you know that, for example, that's not Puerto Rican. When you hear somebody speaking Puerto Rican, you know within a second that that's not Mexican, right? So they're very, very different. So that's why it's fascinating to me to look at what does the child of a Mexican and a Puerto Rican sound like in their Spanish when these two dialects are so different in their phonology and their lexicon and their pragmatics in so many ways.
That's so interesting. Okay, can you explain the differences, if any, in the pedagogical approach between heritage language teaching and second language teaching?
That is a huge question, and I've taught a 16-week course on that. I'll try to give you an answer in
5 minutes.
2 minutes or less. The short answer is linguistically, academically, and affectively. Second language learners and heritage speakers tend to be very, very different. So linguistically, they're what you could call their path to learning a language was very, very different. So you could take someone who's a heritage speaker, someone who's a second language learner. You can give them a test of grammar or vocabulary or something, and you could, based on the results of that test, perhaps say they are similar in their proficiency. They are matched. I keep using my air quotes because I'm not so sure I agree with this, but some people will say these people have the same Spanish proficiency. They can do the same things in Spanish on this test, right? They perform similarly. But when you dig deeper, what you find is that they're very, very different. They're different psycholinguistically, for example, in the ways they do their attachment syntactically. They're different in often the dialect features that they will have. Your second language learners typically speak a prestigious variety of Spanish. They speak a monolingual variety of Spanish. That's what they learned. They're usually very literate because they've learned from books, right? And your heritage speakers, Not always, but very frequently, they will have been exposed to, unfortunately, a dialect that is stigmatized. Okay, they will be also exposed to a bilingual variety, or they will have developed a bilingual variety, what some people call Spanglish. And they also have not been exposed to a great deal, most of them, to literacy, to reading and writing in Spanish. So these differences are huge. The affective differences are huge. Our second language learners don't have really any baggage. They just learn the language. It's like learning math or science. Done deal. Whereas the heritage speakers, there's a lot of what you could call baggage for some of them, right? A lot of them in this country receive very strong messages that any language other than English is not worthwhile. Right? There's a lot of linguistic discrimination in this country. They also, unfortunately, get very strong messages from their own families that the way that they speak Spanish is not good enough. So their sort of linguistic self-esteem is often quite low. And like I say, you don't have that with the second language learners. Finally, you have some academic differences. We know that in general, our Latino population in the US isn't doing as well in school. We have a lot of parents who are working, full-time. Sometimes the parents themselves don't have strong levels of literacy. These kids deal with a lot of very difficult issues a lot of times, which makes it difficult for them to achieve academically. The dropout rates are very, very high. In fact, some people insist on calling them push-out rates, not dropout rates. When you look at our youth of color in this country, some would argue those rates of leaving school are so high that there's something systematic going on that's pushing youth of color out of our school systems. So all of these things together make for the Spanish as a heritage language endeavor being very, very different from teaching it as a new language.
Great, thank you. So here's another question. When considering so here's another question. When considering individual social identity, how important it is for them to maintain their heritage language?
That's an interesting question. I think it would be misguided to insist that people need to maintain their heritage language in order to live fully productive lives, right? I mean, that would be a bit paternalistic. I've spoken with plenty of people in Chicago, for example, who feel that they are Polish, or they feel that they're Chinese, or they feel that they're Mexican or Puerto Rican or Latino, and they do not speak those heritage languages. So I don't think it's in anybody's right to deny them membership in the groups to which they belong via their family ties. That being said, there are lots of good reasons to help people maintain their heritage languages. We know that there are individual benefits of bilingualism. More and more research keeps coming out about cognitive benefits of being bilingual. And you may have seen in the New York Times, I want to say a month or two ago, there was an article about the social benefits of being bilingual. So these are real, tangible, concrete benefits to a person for maintaining a heritage language. Then you move on to the family and community benefits. I find it to be particularly sad when a grandparent cannot speak with their grandchild because the grandparent does not know English and the grandchild does not know the grandparent's language. So that's another strong motivation for helping, right, keep the heritage language alive across generations. And then you have sort of global reasons, right, national reasons. As a nation, it would be wonderful if we could educate all of our children bilingually and have a bilingual citizenry, right? I think this would make us a kinder, more gentler nation, a more understanding nation. So I guess to summarize, we certainly do no one any favors when we insist that they need to speak X-ish in order to be X. However, some people I've spoken with do say, I wish I did speak X-ish. I would feel more X. So if that's coming from them, then I think we can and should respond to those needs by helping them and not waiting until they get to high school. Again, I go back to the dual language bilingual programs. I think it would be wonderful that all children would be able to have the opportunity to study in and through two languages, including their heritage language if they have one.
Thank you so much. So can you shed light on a little about the inspiration for the first book you authored?
The first book I authored was sort of a quick and dirty guide to what I just said, right? How is teaching Spanish for heritage speakers different for second language learners? Tiny little book, I think it's 53 pages. It was meant just as a guide for teachers and for administrators. So in a sense, it's technically my first book, but it wasn't, some of my own research is in there, but it wasn't my own research. My own actual research first book was about the dual language bilingual schools I mentioned earlier. I just became convinced that we really should be educating children through two languages. In this country, we start foreign or second language education typically in high school, which is too late. And when I learned about these dual language schools, sort of the skies opened and the angels sang, and I said, this is wonderful. So that was my doctoral dissertation. I looked at a group of 5th graders in a dual language school. I finished that, and then I realized one day, oh my gosh, those kids are in 8th grade now, let me go back. I collected more data, and I put it together, and that became my first, what you would call, research-based book.
Thank you. In your area of interest, what are some of the big questions being asked right now?
Well, I would say my general area of interest is Spanish in the U.S. And I think I came up with 4 questions that I think people are asking right now. And I have to cheat because I wrote them down. Let's see. 3 of them are more macro questions. And it has to deal with the status of the Spanish language. Is the status of the Spanish language here in the United States changing? And we hope it's improving. In fact, we could say that for all non-English languages. But for Spanish in particular, I think with the influx of Spanish-speaking people, with a little bit of a relaxing, I think, of this boundary that people have kept in this country between English and other languages, the status of any language or any way of speaking any language is really none other than the status of the people who speak it. So when we ask this question, we're also asking important questions about Latinos in this country. We're asking questions about discrimination. We're asking questions about undocumented status and the ways in which that really affects the lives of Latinos through deportation, through fear of deportation and what that means in the workplace and things like that, housing discrimination, all kinds of things. A second macro question, which is related to the first, can we restore dignity and the true meaning of the word bilingual? In this country, the word bilingual has become a dirty word. Bilingual education has been misunderstood and vilified. Even the Office of Bilingual Education has been renamed the Office of English Language Acquisition. So all of these things, we're starting to perhaps turn the corner. You may know in 1998, California voted to outlaw what it understood as bilingual education. Now it seems that people are wanting to undo that. So we're seeing good signs along with some of the less good signs. Can we possibly rescue the positive meaning, the true meaning, bilingual, 2 languages, and educate all of our citizenry through 2 languages? That's, I think, a macro question. The third macro question, how can we take our Latino Spanish speakers, our heritage speakers, how can we broaden, strengthen, enrich, grow their Spanish so that it can do more things for them, but at the same time maintain a critical pedagogy about it? In other words, we should not expect our heritage Spanish speakers to pass for monolinguals, right? That's, I don't think, a really viable goal, nor should it be one that we wish for, right? But on the other hand, when you ask these young people, they will often tell you, I wish I could do more with my Spanish. So they're obviously wanting something. How can we do this in a critical fashion that doesn't denigrate their ways of speaking, that doesn't make them feel that their ways of speaking are less valid than other ways of speaking, but yet also enables them to do more things with Spanish, okay? Maybe in formal contexts and things like that. And then there's a micro question, which I find very interesting, about Spanish in the US, that I think more and more people are asking themselves, which is all the different dialects of Spanish that are present here in the US, how are they influencing each other? And in what parts of the linguistic system? Are we seeing convergence? Are we seeing bidialectalism? What are we seeing phonologically, syntactically, lexically, pragmatically, etc.? These are the 4 questions, at least, that I'm asking and hearing other people ask as well.
That is really interesting. Thank you so much for the interview. We're all looking forward to your talk.
So am I. Thank you so much for inviting me.